Hello everybody. In this part I'll talk about the physiological changes that take place during the development of the brain, or functional changes that gradually appear in the developing brain. As you know that week 2 to week 8 is considered as the embryonic period, and interestingly, electrical activity of the brain starts to show during very early stage of the brain formation. That means during the embryonic period. Until the end of week 5, we do not see any electrical activity. However, at the end of week 5 and into week 6, usually around 40 to 43 days, we first detect the signal, electrical brain activity that begins during that time. And this activity is very poor, extremely weak, and not coherent activity. Any kind of reflex is not detected in the brain. We only see the appearance of very weak, incoherent, random, unsynchronized, weak electrical activity. And at this stage, the brain activity can be compared with the brain activity of a shrimp, or even less than the activity of the brain of a shrimp. And we can also consider this stage of brain activity as neural activity present in the clinically brain dead patients. So it's like that stage of brain activity in adult person we consider as clinically dead brain. Okay. Then at week 8 through week 10, we see more activity develops, and the dorsal induction that appears during week 3rd and 4th. Okay, and then ventral induction occurs a little bit after, during 5th and 6th week of prenatal period. And then during week 8 to 10, the cerebrum begins to develop, that I showed you when I talked about the anatomical development. And then a number of important changes take place in the developing brain. One is during that period, weeks 8 to 10, we see the proliferation of the neurons. So the neurons proliferate, increase their numbers, and also another important thing that we see is the migration of the neurons. Newly formed neurons start to migrate to different directions to form different parts of the brain. Okay, and another important thing we see is the formation of the fibers in the anterior commissure in the corpus callosum. So some fibers, not too many, are start to form, and these fibers connect the two growing hemispheres, and this is considered as the first interhemispheric connection. Okay, small connection develops, and also we see the reflexes appear for the first time during this period. So during this period, 8 to 10 weeks, we see prenatal period, we see a number of important changes or events take place in the brain, developing brain. As I mentioned, first we see the proliferation, okay, and then we see migration of the new neurons throughout the brain, and we see anterior commissure fibers through which the two hemispheres get connected. Small amount of fibers start to connect to hemispheres, and also we see the development of reflexes. Okay, so those changes we see during this period. And then during week 12 to 16, weeks 12 to 16, we see the formation of the frontal and temporal poles of the brain. Okay, and they become apparent during weeks 12 to 16, and the frontal lobe or frontal pole which becomes the neocortex, we know that, and so we see the frontal and temporal poles appear, or becomes apparent, visible, and the frontal pole becomes the neocortex. And these structures develop faster than other parts, so disproportionate growth occurs in these two poles. And then at around 9 weeks, the surface of the cortex appears flat through the 3rd month. That means the surface of the hemisphere is pretty flat, no groove or sulci or gyri. However, by the end of 4th month, the surface is still flat. However, near the end of 4th month or by the end of 4th month, indentations or sulci appear. So you see end of 4th month, we see some indentation grooves or sulci on the surface of the brain. Okay, and eventually these grooves or sulci become more deep and prominent, and that helps to increase the surface area, which is very important in human brain. There are so many sulci and gyri that makes the brain surface very big to accommodate huge number of neurons. Okay, so during this period we continue to see the proliferation of the neurons as well as the migration of the neurons. Those things continue, proliferation and migration of the neurons throughout the cortex. So we see that. And by the end of week 13, the fetus begins to move. 13. The fetus begins to move. That means some motor functions start to develop. And around this time, the corpus callosum, the structure through which huge amount of fibers go from one hemisphere to the contralateral or the opposite hemispheres. So those fibers grow. Massive collection of fibers are formed in the corpus callosum. Okay, and that allows for communication between the hemispheres. Okay, and although the fetus starts to move during this period, still the consciousness of the fetus is not yet developed, and sensory motor processes are not yet established. So although, as I mentioned, the reflex appears very early stage, but or those reflexes are meaningless reflexes, like not directed to any particular stimulus. Developed brain, we know that the reflex, different types of reflexes when different types of stimuli are presented. However, in this stage of brain development, although the reflex is seen, however, that is not due to any particular response to any particular stimulus. Okay. Then another thing start to develop that is extremely important, that is called the synapses. So the proliferation of the neurons, that is the multiplication, right? So the number of neurons increase, and these neurons start to move and go to different directions, right? Migration. So they move towards different directions to form different brain parts. Okay. However, these neurons don't have the processes developed yet. Okay. So the next part is the formation of the processes. So the neurons get the processes, dendrites, axons, those processes are formed eventually. So these neurons change their shape, and mature neurons, they get the axons and dendrites. Okay. And then next is the connections. So the neurons start to form synapses, right? Start to form synapses, start to get connected to each other. So proliferation, these are important changes, right? Proliferation, then migration, processes, okay, then synapses. And the last thing that is very important, after the synapses are formed, the neurons start to synthesize the neurotransmitters and release the neurotransmitters at the synapses. So that is the last thing I will say, neurotransmitters. So now the neurons are connected to each other, and they can transmit the signal by electrochemical means from one neuron to another. Okay. And of course after that, the neurons in particular area get their specific properties, like these neurons will become visual, for example. These neurons will be the auditory. So their own properties, discrete functional areas are developed, and the neurons of those areas gain their own properties. And all these changes during the intrauterine life in the fetus, embryo and fetus, are guided by the genes. So these are innate, okay, less influenced by the experience, and all these changes will occur in the fetus. The behavioral and structural changes occur how the genes transmit that signal. Okay, so genetically determined. And then after the birth, the experience starts to play a very significant role in further development of the brain, or growth of the synapses, growth of the connections between the neurons and their functions. So during the prenatal period, innate properties develop, and in postnatal period the brain development depends on significantly depends on the experience, sensory experience, how we learn the things or see the things, or the events we go through. All those factors play a significant role in postnatal brain development and functions.